Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about a scientific topic, but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. Most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something huge, something we all grapple with. What's right? What's wrong? I mean, for centuries, maybe millennia, that question belonged to philosophers, to religion. They shaped, well, everything really, laws, society, how we treat each other. But things are shifting, right? You see more and more thinkers looking towards science, asking, hey, can science actually give us objective answers about morality?
It's a fascinating shift, definitely. And one of the biggest names pushing this is Sam Harris. He's really front and center in trying to build that bridge between science and moral questions.
Right. The moral landscape, that's his big one on this.
Exactly. And in his talks, too, he basically argues pretty forcefully that, yeah, science can objectively answer questions about right and wrong. His whole approach hinges on measuring well-being, looking at conscious experience.
Which sounds really appealing to a lot of people, I imagine. It feels like an escape route.
Definitely. An escape from, say, moral relativism, where it feels like nothing really matters because everything's subjective.
Or the flip side, rigid religious dogma, where you just have to accept certain rules without question. Harris seems to offer this third path, grounded in facts, in data. Okay, so that's the big picture on Harris. But for this deep dive, we're zooming in on a critique, a specific one. It comes from Jorge Guerra Perez in an article called Morality and Ethics. How come Sam Harris seems to ignore their distinction? And it's important to say up front, Pyers isn't totally dismissing Harris. He actually says he thinks Harris's goal is sincere, important even.
Right. Pyers acknowledges the value in trying to build a secular morality based on well-being. He even sort of gets why Harris might simplify things. For clarity, for reaching a wider audience, sometimes you sacrifice a bit of philosophical precision. Pyers understands that temptation from a practical standpoint.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah, usually is in these discussions.
Pyers mentions a comment from someone named David Coda, and his own rereading of Harris made him think, wait a minute. He felt a deeper dive was needed because Harris consistently seems to treat ethics and morality as basically the same thing.
And Pyers argues that's not just a word choice issue. It's fundamental.
So what are the stakes? Why does this distinction matter so much, according to Pyers?
Well, he thinks this blurring of terms has real consequences. It risks oversimplifying these huge philosophical debates that people have wrestled with for ages. And maybe even more critically, it can kind of paper over significant cultural differences in how people actually live out their values.
Okay, so our mission today, for you listening, is to understand Harris's project, which Pyers himself calls visionary and useful, but also see where it might be, well, incomplete. To see why this critique about ethics versus morality might actually be really important. It's about getting the whole picture. So let's start by really unpacking Harris's vision. What's he trying to build?
That's the perfect place to start. And like you said, Pyers gives Harris credit for the ambition. He's not trying to tear it all down. Harris's main goal, as Pyers lays it out, is to establish a secular morality grounded in human well-being. One that doesn't rely on God or just, whatever my culture says.
Right, breaking free from those two poles.
Exactly. He wants to show that questions of right and wrong aren't just opinions, they can be answered objectively by looking at the actual impact on conscious creatures. It's an attempt to naturalize morality, to make it part of the natural world that science can study, like physics or biology, not something mystical or purely cultural. He's looking for that universal yardstick.
It's definitely bold, taking morality out of the realm of pure belief and into empirical investigation. But how? How does he actually try to make that leap? What are the key steps, the conceptual moves he makes in the moral landscape to say, look, science can bridge this gap?
Okay, so Pyers breaks down several key maneuvers Harris uses. These are really the pillars of his argument. First off, there's the worst possible misery idea.
Ah, yes, I remember reading about that.
Harris uses the self-evident badness of the absolute worst suffering imaginable for everyone. Uses it as a kind of anchor.
An anchor against what?
Relativism? Exactly, to stop the conversation getting bogged down in what Harris sees as trivial relativism. The idea is, look, nobody rational could argue that maximum suffering for all conscious beings is good. It establishes this baseline, this absolute low point that everyone presumably wants to avoid.
So it's a starting point, a universal negative.
Right, a fixed point of badness. If we agree on that, then we have a direction away from it, towards its opposite, which is well-being.
Yeah.
Then there's a second, maybe more subtle point. Pyers calls it a subtle but crucial distinction. Harris claims we can have epistemological objectivity about ontologically subjective states.
Okay. That sounds like serious philosophy jargon. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, it does sound dense, but the idea itself is actually pretty understandable, I think. Ontologically subjective states. That just means experiences, things you feel, your pain, your joy, your sense of consciousness. They exist subjectively within a subject.
Got it. My headache is mine, not yours.
Exactly. But epistemological objectivity is about our knowledge of those states. Harris says even though the feeling is subjective, we can still know objective facts about it. Think about pain again. Your headache is subjective, but we can objectively measure, say, brain activity associated with it, or see how it affects your ability to concentrate, or you could rate it on a scale. Science can study the causes and effects of subjective states.
Okay, so the experience is personal, but the facts about the experience can be objective, measurable.
Precisely. We can study well-being scientifically even if the feeling itself is internal. Third, Harris reinterprets moral language. Words like ought and should.
The classic normative words.
Right. Usually they imply some kind of command, maybe from reason, maybe from God. Harris says, no, they're just shorthand for objective facts about well-being. So when he says we ought to do X, he means doing X demonstrably leads to greater well-being, which is a scientific fact. And if you value well-being, then doing X is the rational thing.
So ought becomes descriptive in a way, describing the path to well-being.
Essentially, yes. It grounds these oughts in empirical consequences, not in some abstract duty or command. It's very consequence-focused, very utilitarian in flavor.
That's a pretty radical reframing of ought. But what about the circularity charge? Doesn't he just assume well-being is good in the first place?
Good question. Pyers notes Harris tackles this head-on. Harris basically says, look, morality needs starting points, just like science or math, axioms.
Like 1 + 1, 2 in math.
Exactly. Or like the assumption in science that the universe follows consistent laws. Harris argues that moral axioms exist alongside these other foundational assumptions. For him, the value of conscious well-being or the badness of suffering is one such axiom. It's a starting point you don't need to derive from something else. It's just fundamentally, intuitively true.
So he's saying, yes, it's an assumption, but it's a necessary foundational one, just like the one science uses.
That's the gist of his defense against circularity. And finally, there's the big metaphor. The moral landscape.
Right, the peaks and valleys.
Yeah, he presents this powerful image of a landscape representing all possible states of conscious experience. The valleys are states of suffering, misery, dysfunction. The peaks are states of flourishing, well-being, happiness. And science, he suggests, is like our map and compass. It can help us understand this terrain and navigate towards the higher peaks, towards better ways of living.
It makes morality seem like an exploration, something we can discover through inquiry.
Exactly. Not just something handed down. It's a very appealing visual for a scientific approach to ethics.
Okay, so putting it all together,
Yeah.
Harris is building this really comprehensive scientific framework. He's trying to give us a method, a way to actually determine right and wrong based on observable effects on well-being. And you can see why that's so attractive, especially now when things feel so polarized or relativistic. He offers a path based on, well, reality. But Pyers sees a problem. A fundamental conceptual oversight, he calls it. This is where we really start the critique, right?
This is exactly where Pyers pivots. He appreciates the architecture Harris has built, but he points to what he sees as a crack in the foundation.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of it. Pyers' main point, the title of his article even, is that Harris fails to clearly distinguish between ethics and morality. And Pyers insists this isn't just, academic nitpicking about words. He thinks it undermines the philosophical rigor and maybe even the usefulness of Harris's whole project. So what is this vital distinction that Pyers thinks Harris overlooks or collapses?
Well, first off, Pyers acknowledges that, yeah, in everyday chat, we used ethics and morality pretty much interchangeably. Ethical dilemma, moral compass, we swap them around.
Right, I probably do it all the time without thinking.
Most of us do. But Pyers argues that, philosophically speaking, they belong to different conceptual categories. And keeping them separate is crucial for clear thinking on this stuff. Conflating them flattens the picture. So let's break down Pyers' definitions. First, ethics with a capital E. Maybe think of it that way. Pyers defines this as the reflective philosophical inquiry into why certain principles or values hold.
So the theory behind it all, the justification.
Exactly. It's metanormative. It steps back from just stating the rules and asks, what are the foundations? How do we justify these moral claims?
Yeah.
What's their scope? If you're asking why is honesty a virtue, or what's the ultimate basis for human rights, or why should well-being be the goal in the first place, that's ethics. It's the study of the principles, the philosophical groundwork. Then there's morality, maybe with the lowercase m. This, for Pyers, refers to the actual set of norms, customs, and practices that govern behavior within a community or culture at a given time.
Okay, so this is more about what people actually do and believe in practice.
Right. It's descriptive, it's contingent, meaning it depends on time and place. Pyers notes it very significantly across history and societies. Think about, specific rules about diet, clothing, marriage customs, how different cultures treat animals or the dead. These are all part of a society's morality, the lived rules, the specific codes of conduct.
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my book about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully in the future I'm going to write also about religion, atheism and science. But I do have a podcast, I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion, the same name of the podcast, and you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion and atheism. So hope you enjoyed the show. So let's come back to the show.
So ethics is the why, the universal theory maybe. And morality is the what, the specific rules on the ground.
That's a good way to think about it. Ethics is the philosophical framework. Morality is the set of actual lived rules and customs within a specific group.
Okay, the distinction seems clear when you lay it out like that. But why does Pyers argue it matters so much? What goes wrong if we just treat them as synonyms, like Harris seems to?
Pyers thinks the biggest danger is that we risk conflating culturally relative practices with universal normative principles. He points out that in the moral landscape, in interviews, Harris just slides between using morality and ethics without really flagging the shift. And while making it all one thing, call it morality, defined as maximizing well-being, is conceptually elegant, Pyers warns it risks obscuring what Harris is actually doing at any given moment. Is he making a universal ethical claim about well-being applying to all conscious life, or is he critiquing a specific cultural morality because it harms well-being?
I see. So by using one term, he might be applying a universal standard, ethics, to judge a local practice, morality, without clearly acknowledging that they operate on different levels.
That's exactly the worry. It can make it seem like he's dismissing a whole culture's morality as simply scientifically wrong, without fully engaging with the fact that morality, as Pyers defines it, is culturally situated. The nuance gets lost.
That definitely clarifies the potential problem. Can you give a specific example from Pyers' article? How does this blurring of ethics and morality actually show up in one of Harris's arguments?
Sure. Pyers uses the example of Harris condemning practices like preventing women from reading. Harris's argument is straightforward within his framework. Denying women education clearly hinders their well-being, their potential, their flourishing. Therefore, based on the science of well-being, it's objectively morally wrong. Full stop.
Okay, and few people today would disagree with the conclusion that preventing women from reading is wrong. So what's Pyers' issue with how Harris argues it?
Pyers' critique isn't about the conclusion itself, obviously. It's about the framing. He says Harris's judgment here treats morality as if it were universally fixed, and overlooks the fact that morality, in Pyers' sense, is culturally embedded. Think historically or across different cultures. Sadly, societies have existed, and some might still, where preventing women's education was part of the accepted morality. People within that system might have believed it was right, because it fit their social structure, their interpretation of tradition or religion. It was a moral norm for them, however flawed we see it now, based on universal ethical principles about well-being or rights.
So Harris is applying his universal ethical standard, well-being, to critique a specific cultural morality.
Yes, but according to Pyers, he does it without explicitly making that distinction clear. Harris is very effective at attacking moral relativism by pointing to objective harm. But Pyers suggests he simultaneously, quote, neglects to acknowledge that morality, as lived and experienced, is deeply plural and situated, end quote. The lived moralities of different groups do vary. By not distinguishing clearly, Harris risks making it sound like these different moralities are just scientific errors, rather than complex systems of norms that evolve within specific contexts, which can then be evaluated against a universal ethical standard like well-being. This conceptual flattening, as Pyers calls it, leads to arguments that kind of gloss over essential complexities. It mixes the universal ethical claim with the critique of specific contingent moral practices.
Okay, that makes the critique much clearer. It's about the philosophical precision and acknowledging the different levels of analysis. So this ethics-morality distinction is the core issue Pyers raises. But you mentioned his article goes further. What other challenges or maybe limitations does Pyers identify in Harris's project beyond this central point?
Yeah, he broadens the critique. It's not just about the terminology. He points to other areas where Harris's focus on a purely scientific, well-being-based framework might be, well, incomplete or run into trouble. He discusses the underlying assumptions, how it handles real-world cultural differences, and what might get left out when you focus solely on quantifiable well-being. Let's take the first one, what Pyers calls the unacknowledged normative premise. This goes right back to the foundations. Pyers argues that Harris's entire system, this whole moral landscape built on well-being, rests on a fundamental assumption, the idea that conscious well-being is the supreme moral value.
Okay. And Pyers' point is that this assumption itself isn't a scientific fact.
Exactly. He says this premise is a normative ethical choice, not a fact derivable from science. Science can tell us what leads to well-being, maybe how to measure it, what its neural correlates are. But science, Pyers insists, can't tell us that well-being ought to be our ultimate goal. That's a value judgment we bring to the science.
Right. This sounds exactly like the is-ought problem we touched on earlier. You can't get a prescription from a description alone.
Precisely. Pyers directly invokes Hume's is-ought gap. He reminds us that no amount of empirical data alone can prescribe what ought to be done. He suggests Harris uses powerful examples like the moral landscape or the famous hot stove analogy.
Where touching a hot stove is obviously bad for well-being.
Right. Harris presents these as if the empirical facts themselves automatically generate the ought. Avoid the stove because it causes pain, and pain demonstrably reduces well-being. But Pyers argues this sidesteps the crucial step, the prior ethical commitment to valuing well-being and avoiding suffering in the first place. Why is pain bad? Why is well-being good? Science describes the pain. It doesn't in itself label it bad. That's a value we hold.
So the scientific framework is built on a value that isn't itself scientifically proven. It's chosen.
That's Pyre's point. Harris's model looks incredibly scientific, but it rests on this foundational ethical choice prioritizing well-being. And other ethical systems might prioritize different things like duty, virtue, rights, divine commands. Harris's choice is defensible, maybe even compelling, but it's still a philosophical starting point, a normative premise, not just a raw scientific finding.
That's a really fundamental challenge to the idea of a purely scientific morality. Okay, so that's the philosophical premise. What about the real world? Does evidence of how morality works in different cultures pose a problem for Harris's universal landscape?
Yes, Pyers argues it does. He brings up the moral machine experiment, that huge MIT study.
Oh yeah, the self-driving car dilemmas. I remember that. Millions of people took part, right?
Exactly. Millions from all over the world. They were faced with these forced choices. Who should the autonomous car sacrifice in an unavoidable crash? Passengers, pedestrians, old people, young people, rule followers, jaywalkers. And the results weren't uniform at all. They found really diverse moral preferences depending on the country or cultural cluster.
Can you give an example?
Sure. For instance, people in countries often described as more collectivist, maybe in East Asia, tended to show a stronger preference for saving younger people over older people. Whereas in some Western cultures, that preference might be less pronounced, or other factors might weigh more heavily, like saving more lives regardless of age, or perhaps protecting passengers.
Wow. So real-world moral intuitions, even in a hypothetical scenario, seem to vary quite a bit globally.
They really do. There were differences in prioritizing humans versus animals, social status, all sorts of variations.
So how does this challenge Harris's model directly? If everyone is supposedly navigating the same moral landscape towards peaks of well-being, why these different choices?
Well, Pyers puts the question sharply. If machines programmed with morality must shift their ethical choices by country, how can Harris's universal moral landscape account for such pluralism? If the right answer, derived scientifically from well-being, is supposed to be universal, why do massive global surveys reveal such different priorities in these life and death trade-offs? It strongly suggests that even if well-being is a shared goal in some abstract sense, how it's defined, what aspects of it are prioritized, for example, individual survival versus saving youth for the future, and how it's weighed against other values, like obeying rules, is deeply shaped by culture.
So the landscape might have peaks, but different cultures are trying to climb them using different routes, or they might even disagree on which peak is the highest.
Nothing like that. Pyers concludes the experiment shows moral decision-making is deeply embedded in cultural contexts, which really complicates any purely scientific objectivist approach. It highlights this real-world pluralism that a single universal science-derived map seems to struggle to fully encompass without acknowledging the role of culture in shaping moral priorities.
Okay, so we have the unacknowledged premise, the challenge from cultural variation. Is there anything else Pyers points to? You mentioned something about what gets left out.
Yes, the third major point Pyers raises is about the potential limitations of reducing everything to measurable well-being. He asks if this focus might exclude other crucial ethical dimensions. He argues that Harris's approach tends to sideline concepts like dignity, autonomy, integrity, and meaning.
Things that feel really important to being human, but maybe aren't easy to stick a number on.
Exactly. Pyers calls these values central to human experience, but resistant to straightforward quantification. Lith. Think about dignity. How do you measure that with an fMRI? Or autonomy, our ability to make our own choices, even if those choices don't maximize our immediate happiness. A prisoner might have basic needs met, maybe even report okay levels of moment-to-moment well-being if they adapt. But have they lost something vital related to autonomy and dignity?
That's a good point. Or integrity, sticking to your principles even when it's hard. That might cause short-term stress, reducing measurable well-being, but we often admire it ethically.
Right. Or the search for meaning. People often find meaning through challenges, through service, through art, through things that aren't just about feeling good moment to moment. Reducing the entire moral calculus to measurable well-being risks missing these deeper, perhaps less quantifiable, but arguably essential aspects of a good human life.
So what's the danger if these things, dignity, autonomy, meaning, get sidelined because they don't fit neatly into a scientific metric of well-being? What does that do to our understanding of ethics?
Pyers believes that ethics, properly understood, must grapple with these complex, emergent aspects of existence. You can't just ignore them because they're hard to measure. He warns that doing so diminishes the richness and responsiveness of ethical inquiry. It makes our ethical framework potentially less comprehensive, less able to capture the full spectrum of what matters to us as humans. Imagine, for instance, a purely well-being-focused system deciding it's okay to sacrifice individual rights or autonomy for a slight increase in overall societal happiness. An ethic that includes dignity and autonomy as intrinsic values, not just contributors to well-being, would likely resist that trade-off.
So focusing only on quantifiable well-being might lead to conclusions that clash with other deeply held ethical intuitions.
It's a real risk, Pyers highlights. A truly robust ethics needs to account for these harder-to-measure but critically important human values. Otherwise, the moral landscape Harris maps might be missing some crucial features.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at Harris's really ambitious project to ground morality in science, and then Pyers's detailed critique focusing on the ethics-morality distinction, the underlying assumptions, cultural pluralism, and these missing non-quantifiable dimensions. So bringing it all together, what's the final word from Pyers? What's the big takeaway regarding this price of conceptual flattening?
Pyers wraps it up by saying that Harris's project, while visionary, is ultimately incomplete. He states pretty clearly that Harris's intentional dismissal of the ethics-morality distinction, combined with the failure to recognize normative premises and the insufficient engagement with cultural pluralism, all serve to limit the explanatory power of his model. Again, it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Pyers sees the value in Harris's goal. But he argues the way Harris constructs the argument, particularly by collapsing ethics and morality and relying solely on well-being, leaves significant gaps and potentially oversimplifies the very thing he's trying to explain.
The price of that elegance and simplicity is a loss of crucial nuance and philosophical depth.
That seems to be Pyers' bottom line. The flattening comes at a cost to explanatory power and philosophical rigor.
And what about the importance of maintaining that distinction between ethics and morality? Is it just for philosophers, or does Pyers think it matters more broadly?
He argues it's fundamental for anyone serious about the topic, whether approaching it philosophically or scientifically. He says, respecting the conceptual boundaries between ethics and morality is not mere pedantry, it is indispensable, end quote. The warning is clear. Without it, the risk is conflating universal prescriptions with culturally contingent practices and mistaking normative choices for empirical facts, end quote. We end up talking past each other, or mistaking our own values for objective truths derived purely from science. And Pyers leaves us with a question, really. How does this affect how we deal with real-world moral disagreements in our interconnected world? If we think science gives us the single answer via the moral landscape, how do we understand and engage with cultures whose moral priorities seem different, as revealed by things like the moral machine experiment? Do we just say they're scientifically wrong? Or does acknowledging the distinction between universal ethical aspirations, diverse cultural moralities, allow for a more nuanced, respectful, and ultimately more productive dialogue? Pyers leans towards the latter.
Wow. Yeah, this deep dive really drives home how complex these seemingly simple ideas of right and wrong actually are. It shows that even when we try to bring the clarity of science to bear, the philosophical foundations, the words we use, the assumptions we make, they all matter immensely. It's not just about the data, it's about the framework we use to interpret it and being aware of the values embedded in that framework.
Exactly. Pyers' critique isn't about rejecting science's role, but about making the whole enterprise more robust, more self-aware, more philosophically sound. It's a call for greater precision and a recognition of complexity. It encourages all of us, you listening included, to be more critical consumers of these arguments, to ask those deeper questions about terminology and assumptions when we talk about values.
So for you listening, as you navigate your own thoughts on morality or encounter debates about universal values versus cultural practices, maybe especially with things like AI ethics, where we literally have to code morality, ask yourself, are people using ethics and morality interchangeably? If so, what might be getting lost? Is well-being the only value being discussed? Or are things like dignity, autonomy, meaning part of the conversation? What are the baseline assumptions being made, and are they presented as scientific facts or as the value choices they might actually be? And perhaps most importantly, what aspects of the rich, sometimes messy human experience might resist easy quantification but are still fundamental to living a good ethical life? Lots to think about. Keep questioning and keep diving deeper.
Hey there! You arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel, and also keep watching, because there are 7 episodes. So you just if you enjoy this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence, and also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium, and there are several blog posts there, and you can enjoy it, you can read it, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you, and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.